Chapter 1. The Price of Redemption. Magnus the Red stood in a place that existed between spaces, where thought took form and will shaped reality. The Emperor's psychic domain stretched around them both, not the throne room of the imperial palace where his body sat in eternal vigil, but something deeper, something truer. Here, father and son faced each other as they truly were, two beings of immense power wrapped in the flesh of kings and monsters. The air itself hummed with potential. Magnus could feel the weight of terror burning above them, could sense his brother Horus pressing ever closer to the palace walls with his corrupted legions. The siege had reached its crescendo, and yet here they stood, suspended in this moment of terrible possibility. My son. The Emperor's voice carried the weight of 10,000 years. You came to warn me once before. Now I offer you the chance to do more than warn, to save. Magnus felt his breath catch. The memory of that catastrophic sending still burned in him like an old wound. He had tried to pierce the webway to reach his father, to tell him of Horus's treachery. Instead, he had shattered the very foundations of the Emperor's greatest work. Demons had poured through the breach he created. The dream of humanity's independence from the warp had died in that moment. I destroyed it, Magnus said, the words coming out hollow. Your great work, the webway. I destroyed everything. You broke what I had built. Yes. The Emperor stepped forward, and Magnus saw something in those ancient eyes he had not expected. Understanding. But you also revealed its weakness. A foundation built in secret, maintained by deception, was always doomed to fail. Perhaps it needed to break before it could be rebuilt properly. The admission staggered Magnus. For decades he had carried the guilt of that moment, the knowledge that his attempt to help had become the very instrument of humanity's doom. He had fled to the planet of sorcerers, had bargained with Tzeentch, had led his sons deeper into corruption, all because he believed his father could never forgive what he had done. The Golden Throne was always meant for you, the Emperor continued, not as a prison, but as the seat from which you would guide humanity's psychic evolution, from which you would master the webway and open the galaxy to our children. Magnus's throat tightened. My legion will not survive in the form you cherish. The Emperor's words fell between them, like stones dropping into still water. The flesh change runs too deep. Tzeentch's mark is upon them all. To return to the light, to serve as you were meant to serve, requires sacrifice. The word hung in the air between them. Sacrifice. Magnus understood what was being asked. His sons, brilliant, scholarly, devoted, would have to die. The 1,000 sons who had followed him into exile, who had trusted him to lead them back to glory, would be the price of his redemption. They followed me, Magnus whispered. Through everything, they followed me. And they will follow you still into whatever comes after. The Emperor's expression softened, and for a moment Magnus glimpsed not the master of mankind, but simply a father watching his son struggle with an impossible choice. Their sacrifice will not be meaningless. Their knowledge, their wisdom, it can be preserved. But their flesh is beyond saving. Magnus closed his eyes and reached out with his psychic senses, feeling the presence of his legion gathered in the ruins around Terra. Ahriman, his loyal equerry, still holding faith that his primarch would find a way to restore their legion's glory. Uthizar, whose flesh had begun its slow dissolution into feathered mutation weeks ago, but who continued to fight. Thousands of warriors who had burned their homeworld to follow him into exile. If I accept, Magnus said slowly, if I take the throne, what becomes of you? I will guide you for as long as I am able. But the battle with Horus approaches, and I may not survive it unchanged." The Emperor's voice carried a note of something that might have been resignation. The future will require new hands to shape it. Magnus felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him, the siege above, his legion's expectations, his father's fading strength, the golden throne waiting empty while demons pressed against the webway's failing barriers. He thought of his sons again, each face rising in his memory. Aemon, who had devoted his life to understanding the mysteries of the flesh. Sobek, whose tactical brilliance had saved them countless times. Hathor Mat, who still believed their Primarch could work miracles. "They trust me to find another way," Magnus said. "Sometimes trust requires the courage to do what those who trust you cannot understand." The Emperor reached out, his hand stopping just short of Magnus's shoulder. "This is the burden of leadership, my son. To bear the weight of choices others cannot make." Magnus opened his eyes and looked directly at his father. In the Emperor's face, he saw the same terrible weight he now carried, the knowledge of what must be done for the greater good, even when that good demanded the sacrifice of everything precious. The psychic realm around them seemed to pulse with anticipation. Somewhere above, Vulcan waited in the palace corridors, ready to strike down a brother he believed had fallen beyond redemption. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Horus marshaled his forces for the final assault. And somewhere in the ruined streets of Terra, the 1,000 Suns prepared for what they believed would be their moment of vindication. Magnus straightened, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones like gravity. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured authority of a Primarch, but also something new, the terrible clarity of a man who had chosen to pay any price for redemption. "I accept." The words seemed to echo in the space between souls, carrying with them the weight of futures unmade and paths untaken. Magnus felt something shift in the fabric of reality around them, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. "Then let us begin," the Emperor said, and for the first time in decades, Magnus heard something like hope in his father's voice. "Your legion awaits your final command, and the Golden Throne awaits its true master." Magnus nodded, already feeling the psychic presence of his sons pressing at the edges of his awareness. They would not understand. They could not be made to understand, but they would follow him one last time into the sacrifice that would purchase humanity's future. The price of redemption, he realized, was not measured in worlds conquered or enemies slain. It was measured in the willingness to destroy everything you loved for something greater than yourself. And Magnus the Red, Primarch of the 1,000 Suns, was finally ready to pay it. Chapter 2. The Crimson King's Confession. The psychic realm dissolved around Magnus like smoke before wind, and he found himself standing once more in the ruins of Terra's outer districts. The acrid smell of burning promethium and charred ceramite filled his nostrils. Above, the palace's golden spires caught the dying light of the sun, their beauty almost obscene against the devastation spread below. His sons waited for him. The 1,000 Suns had established their position in what had once been a Sholem district, the broken remains of learning halls and librarium towers forming a perimeter that spoke to their nature even in war. Ahriman stood at their center, his ornate power armor catching the light of the fires that burned throughout the city. Around him, the surviving captains of the Legion maintained their vigil, warriors whose names Magnus had spoken like prayers during his communion with the Emperor. Amon looked up first, his psychically sensitive nature allowing him to feel his Primarch's approach before the others. The chief librarian's expression shifted from relief to something approaching wariness as Magnus drew closer. Perhaps he sensed the weight of what had transpired. Perhaps he simply recognized the look in his Gene father's eye. "My lord," Ahriman stepped forward, his movements fluid despite the bulk of his Terminator plate. "We felt your presence recede from the material realm. Did you commune with—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Did you reach our father?" Magnus stopped before his assembled sons and felt the full weight of what he was about to do settle onto his shoulders. These warriors had followed him through the destruction of Prospero. They had endured exile and mutation, had seen their flesh slowly consumed by the changes that marked them as Tzeentch's own. They had trusted him to find a way back to glory. "I spoke with the Emperor," Magnus said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled warriors. "We have been offered redemption." A ripple of emotion passed through the gathered Astartes. Magnus could feel their hope rising, could sense the psychic resonance of a legion that believed their long exile might finally be ending. Sobek stepped closer, his tactical mind already working through the implications. "What are the terms?" the Pavoni captain asked. Magnus looked at each of them in turn. Hathor Mat, whose devotion had never wavered despite everything they had endured. Uthizar, whose flesh bore the visible marks of the change, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Phoses Takar, youngest of the captains but wise beyond his years. Each face was known to him, each name written in his heart. "The terms," Magnus said slowly, "require sacrifice." Ahriman's eyes narrowed. His equerry had always been perceptive, had always seen deeper than the surface of things. "What kind of sacrifice, my lord?" The words felt like poison in Magnus's throat, but he forced them out anyway. "The flesh change has progressed too far. The taint of the warp runs too deep in our gene seed. To return to the Emperor's side, to serve as we were meant to serve, the Legion must be cleansed." The silence that followed was deafening. Magnus watched as understanding dawned in their eyes, saw the precise moment when hope curdled into horror. "You mean to kill us?" Uthizar said, his voice flat with disbelief. "To murder your own sons for the approval of the tyrant who condemned us in the first place." "I mean to free you," Magnus replied, though the words tasted like ash. "The change will claim you all eventually. You know this. Your flesh rebels against itself, transforms into shapes that serve only the dark gods. This way, your sacrifice has meaning." Hathor Mat stepped forward, his face twisted with anguish. "My lord, surely there is another way. The knowledge we have gathered, the lore we have preserved, it could serve the Legion's restoration. We could find a cure, could purge the taint without destroying ourselves." "I have seen the future the Emperor offers," Magnus said, and he let them feel a shadow of the vision that had been shared with him. Humanity free from the warp's influence, traveling the galaxy through the webway instead of the roiling madness of chaos. But that future requires a guardian on the golden throne, and it requires that guardian to be untainted. Ahriman's breathing had grown labored, and Magnus realized his equerry was fighting back tears. "All these years," Ahriman whispered, "all these years we followed you, believed in you, trusted that you would lead us home. And now you tell us that home requires our deaths." "Yes," Magnus said simply. The word hung in the air like a judgment. Magnus felt the psychic temperature around them drop as his sons processed the enormity of what he was asking. Some, he realized, were already calculating odds of escape. Others were sinking into despair. A few, the most loyal, the ones who had never truly doubted, were struggling to accept what their primarch demanded of them. Phoses Takar was the first to speak again. "If we refuse?" "Then you remain here to die in the siege, or flee back to Sortiarius to live as pawns of Tzeentch until the change finally claims you. Magnus met the young captain's eyes. There is no path that leads to your survival in the forms you now wear. Sobek's tactical mind was working through scenarios. Magnus could see it in his posture. And if we accept, what becomes of us then? Your knowledge will be preserved. Your loyalty will be remembered. Your sacrifice will purchase humanity's freedom from the warp. Magnus gestured toward the palace, its golden spires gleaming in the distance. I will take the golden throne as the Emperor intended, and through it I will guide our species toward the future they deserve. At the cost of your sons' lives, Amon said, his voice heavy with accusation. At the cost of my sons' lives, Magnus agreed. The admission seemed to break something in the assembled warriors. Magnus felt their emotional cohesion fracturing, some pulling away in horror, while others pressed closer in desperate need to understand. He had expected this. He had hoped for it to be easier. It was Ahriman who voiced what they were all thinking. You are asking us to trust you one final time, to follow you into death because you believe it serves a greater purpose. I am, Magnus said. And if you are wrong, if this sacrifice accomplishes nothing? Magnus considered lying, considered offering reassurances he could not give. Instead, he chose honesty. Then we will have died as we lived, together and in service to something greater than ourselves. The psychic field around them pulsed with conflicting emotions. Magnus could feel his son's loyalty warring with their desire for survival, their love for him clashing against their horror at what he proposed. It was Uthizar who broke first, his mutated features twisting with rage. No, the warrior snarled. I will not die for your pride, Crimson King. I will not let you murder me for the approval of the father who cast us out. The captain's hand moved to his bolt pistol, but before he could draw it, Magnus reached out with his psychic might and held him motionless. Not violently, he could have crushed the warrior's mind without effort, but with the gentle, inexorable pressure of absolute authority. I understand your anger, Magnus said quietly. I share it, but I will not permit you to force my hand. Uthizar struggled against the invisible bonds, his eyes blazing with fury. You would use sorcery against your own sons? To prevent them from damning themselves further, yes. Magnus looked around at the assembled warriors. Any of you who wish to depart may do so. Return to Sortiarius. Flee to the outer reaches of the galaxy. I will not pursue you, but neither will I allow you to interfere with what must be done here. One by one, the 1,000 sons made their choice. Some turned away, unable to watch their Primarch's final act. Others remained, their faces set with the grim determination of warriors who had chosen to trust their gene father one last time. Ahriman stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate. He reached up and removed his helmet, revealing a face marked by tears Magnus had never seen him shed. I have followed you through exile and damnation, my lord, Ahriman said, his voice thick with emotion. If you ask it of me, I will follow you through death as well. Magnus felt his own composure threatening to crack. Arzek. No, his equerry said firmly. Do not make this about sentiment. You are our Primarch, our father, our gene sire. If you believe this is necessary, then we will trust your judgment. He paused, then added more quietly, we will trust you to remember us. The ritual itself was almost anticlimactic after the emotional devastation of the confession. Magnus reached out with his psychic power, gently severing the connections that bound his sons to the warp. One by one, the 1,000 sons felt the taint of chaos lift from their souls, and in that moment of purification, their bodies simply dispersed, They crumbled to ash and dust, their armor falling empty to the broken ground. Magnus felt each death as a knife to his heart, felt the psychic resonance of their passing echo through the ruins around them. When it was finished, he stood alone among the remnants of his legion, surrounded by empty ceramite and settling dust. The wind that blew across the killing fields of Terra carried their ashes away, scattering them across the city where they had chosen to die for their father's redemption. Magnus knelt and gathered a handful of the dust that had been Ahriman, letting it run through his fingers like sand. When he rose, his face was set in lines of terrible determination. His sons were gone. His legion was dead. Now came the hardest part, living with what he had done for the sake of what must be. Chapter 3. Brothers in Arms. The approach to the palace walls felt like walking through a graveyard of his own making. Magnus moved alone across the scarred wasteland that had once been Terra's most beautiful districts, the dust of his legion still clinging to his armor. Above him, the massive fortifications of the imperial palace rose like golden mountains against the smoke-choked sky, their surfaces scarred by weeks of bombardment, but still magnificent in their defiance. He carried no weapon. The staff that had been his constant companion for decades lay broken in the ruins behind him, another casualty of the choice he had made. Instead, he bore a simple white banner, a piece of cloth torn from his own cloak and affixed to a broken piece of rebar. It was crude, makeshift, but its meaning was unmistakable. Truce, parley, surrender. The first shots came from the outer defensive positions, las bolts and autocannon rounds that struck the ground around his feet in precise patterns. Warning shots. Magnus continued walking, his pace steady and deliberate, and gradually the firing ceased as word spread along the defensive lines. The massive figure approaching under a flag of truce was unmistakably a Primarch, and even the most hardened defenders hesitated to fire upon one of the Emperor's gene sons. When he reached the base of the outer wall, Magnus stopped and waited, the silence stretched between him and the defenders above, heavy with the weight of history and blood. These warriors had heard of the burning of Prospero. They knew what the Space Wolves had found there. They knew what Magnus had become. The gates didn't open. Instead, a figure appeared atop the battlements, massive even at that distance. Rogel Dawn, Praetorian of Terra, stood silhouetted against the burning sky, with his yellow armor gleaming like a second sun. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the killing ground, amplified by voxcasters built into the wall itself. "Magnus of the Thousand Suns," Dawn called down, "you come to us under a flag of truce, but your legion has already declared for the traitors. Explain yourself before I order my guns to speak." Magnus looked up at his brother, noting the way Dawn's hand rested on the pommel of his chainsword. Even now, even with the banner in his hands, the Lord of the 7th Legion was ready for treachery. Magnus could not blame him for it. "I come to offer my service to the defense of Terra," Magnus replied, his voice carrying easily to the walls above. "My legion is dead. I have killed them myself, rather than allow them to serve chaos further. I seek redemption through loyalty." A murmur ran along the battlements. Magnus could see other figures gathering, imperial fists, custodians, even what looked like blood angels in their crimson plate. Word was spreading quickly through the palace's defenders. The prodigal son had returned. Dawn's expression remained skeptical. "Pretty words from one who has consorted with demons. How do we know this is not another of your sorceries? Another deception designed to breach our defenses?" "You know because our father has already spoken for me." The voice came from above and behind Dawn, carrying the unmistakable authority of the Emperor himself. Magnus felt the psychic pressure of his father's presence, even through the layers of stone and adamantium that separated them. When the Emperor spoke again, his words seemed to resonate in the very air around the palace. My son Magnus returns to us, cleansed of the taint that drove him into exile. He has paid the price of his redemption in the blood of his own legion. Let the gates be opened to him. Magnus watched Dawn's face carefully, saw the moment when duty overrode suspicion. The Praetorian was many things, stubborn, prideful, unforgiving, but he was also utterly loyal to the Emperor's will. If their father commanded that Magnus be allowed entry, then Dawn would obey, regardless of his personal feelings. The massive gates began to grind open with a sound like thunder. Magnus folded his makeshift banner and tucked it into his belt, then walked forward into the stronghold he had helped to assault just hours before. The reception waiting for him inside was decidedly mixed. Imperial fists formed a corridor leading toward the inner palace, their bolters held at the ready but not quite aimed at him. Custodians flanked the path, their guardian spears gleaming with power field activation. These were not welcoming gestures, they were precautions against treachery. Dawn strode down from the walls to meet him personally, his movements quick and efficient, despite the weight of his ceremonial armor. Up close, Magnus could see the toll the siege had taken on his brother. Dark circles ringed Dawn's eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty maintenance. The Praetorian had not slept properly in days. "Brother," Dawn said, the word carrying no warmth whatsoever, "you will forgive me if I find your timing convenient." "I find it necessary," Magnus replied evenly. "Horus grows stronger with each passing hour. The palace's defenders grow fewer. If my presence here can tip the balance, then convenience becomes irrelevant." Before Dawn could respond, another figure approached from the direction of the inner gates. Sanguinius moved with the fluid grace that marked him even among his superhuman brothers, his white wings folded against his back, and his golden hair streaming in the wind that swept through the palace corridors. Unlike Dawn, the angel's face showed something that might have been hope. "Magnus," Sanguinius said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "I had feared we would never see you again, except as an enemy." "You nearly didn't," Magnus admitted. "The path back from exile has been costly." Sanguinius's expression grew somber as he took in Magnus's appearance. The dust that still clung to his armor, the broken staff at his belt, the hollow look in his eyes that spoke of recent grief. "Your legion? Gone." The word came out flat, final. "Sacrificed to purge the taint that would have claimed them eventually." The angel's face showed understanding and sympathy in equal measure. Of all his brothers, Sanguinius alone truly comprehended the weight of necessary sacrifice. His own legion struggled with the red thirst, and he knew what it meant to watch his sons battle against their own nature. "Then you have paid a price few would willingly bear," Sanguinius said quietly. "Your father spoke truly. You have earned your redemption." Dawn remained unconvinced. Redemption is earned through action, not sacrifice. Words and gestures mean nothing if they are not backed by deeds. "Then give me the chance to provide those deeds," Magnus said, turning to face the Praetorian directly. "I know Horus's strategies. I know his strengths and weaknesses. I know which of the traitor legions can be relied upon, and which might still be turned. Most importantly, I know the sorceries he employs, and how they might be countered." That caught Dawn's attention. The Lord of the 7th Legion was too practical to let personal animosity override tactical advantage. "What do you propose?" Magnus gestured toward the palace's highest towers, where psychic lightning still flickered around the damaged structures. "The webway breach beneath the throne room continues to hemorrhage demons. Your father spends his strength containing it, when that strength could be better used elsewhere. With my help, the breach can be sealed properly, freeing him for the final confrontation with Horus. And we should trust you to work sorcery in the heart of our defenses? Dawn's voice carried a note of incredulity. You should trust me to clean up the mess I made, Magnus replied simply. I broke the webway. I know how it was broken, and I know how to fix it. Before Dawn could object further, alarms began blaring throughout the palace complex. Magnus felt the psychic resonance of massed violence approaching from the south, where Horus's forces had been gathering for another assault. The War Master had chosen this moment, perhaps sensing Magnus's defection, to launch a major offensive against the palace's outer defenses. It seems the theoretical discussion is over, Sanguinius observed, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. Brother, he said to Magnus, if you truly wish to prove your loyalty, the opportunity presents itself. Magnus nodded, feeling a familiar surge of anticipation that had nothing to do with the prospect of battle and everything to do with the chance to stand beside his brothers once more. Where do you need me? Dawn's tactical mind was already working through deployments and defensive positions. Despite his suspicions, he recognized the value of another Primarch in the coming fight. The southern gate is taking the heaviest pressure. Your abilities could prove useful in countering whatever sorceries the enemy brings to bear. Then that's where I'll go, Magnus said. Sanguinius stepped forward, his expression serious. Brother, understand that the warriors you'll be fighting beside have no reason to trust you. Some of them were at Prospero. Others have heard the stories. You'll need to prove yourself not just to us, but to them. Magnus thought of the imperial fists who had maintained their corridor formation even as their Primarch spoke with him, their weapons ready and their eyes watchful. He thought of the custodians whose loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, but whose memory of his failures was longer still. Most of all, he thought of his father, waiting somewhere in the depths of the palace for Magnus to prove that his sacrifice had meaning. I understand, he said. I'll earn their trust the same way I'll earn my redemption. One act at a time. As if to emphasize his point, explosions began to rock the southern wall as Horus's artillery found its range. Magnus could feel the psychic backlash of demon engines in the enemy ranks, their presence a familiar itch at the back of his mind. The battle that would test his newfound loyalty was beginning whether he was ready for it or not. Dawn made his decision with characteristic bluntness. Very well. You'll fight with Captain Sigismund's assault troops. If you betray us, he has orders to kill you personally. Magnus smiled grimly. I would expect nothing less. The three Primarchs moved toward the southern defenses together, their stride eating up the distance with superhuman efficiency. Around them, the palace came alive with the controlled chaos of defenders moving to their positions. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of enemy gunfire was growing closer. Magnus felt something he had not experienced in decades, the simple satisfaction of standing beside his brothers in defense of something greater than themselves. It would not last. Nothing good ever did in this galaxy. But for now, in this moment, he was exactly where he belonged. The rest would be earned in blood and fire, the way all worthwhile things were earned in the grim darkness of the far future. Chapter 4. The Webway Gambit. The descent into the palace's deepest levels felt like traveling backward through time itself. Magnus followed the golden-armored custodian down passages that grew progressively older and more ornate as they approached the heart of the Emperor's great work. Here, beneath layers of adamantium and ceramite, lay the entrance to humanity's greatest achievement and its greatest failure. Tribune Valdor himself led the escort, his guardian spear crackling with barely contained energy. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes moved with the fluid precision of a master warrior, but Magnus could sense the tension in his posture. Even here, surrounded by his own guards in the most secure location in the galaxy, Valdor remained ready for treachery. "The breach lies beyond this threshold," Valdor said, as they approached a massive portal sealed with both physical barriers and psychic wards. "For years we have held it closed through constant vigilance and the Emperor's will. Many of my brotherhood have died, maintaining this containment." Magnus felt the familiar ache of guilt settle in his chest. Those deaths were on his hands, as surely as if he had wielded the blade himself. His desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery had torn a hole between realities, and everything that had followed, the demon incursions, the Emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne, the slow degradation of the Imperial webway, was the price of that single, catastrophic moment. "Show me," Magnus said quietly. The seals parted at Valdor's command, revealing a corridor that defied the laws of physics. The passage beyond was not built from stone or metal, but from crystallized thought and solidified will. This was the webway as the Emperor had envisioned it, a network of tunnels through which humanity could travel without touching the roiling madness of the warp. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it was a nightmare. The walls wept with an oily substance that moved with deliberate malevolence. Shadows danced where no light cast them, and the air itself seemed to whisper with voices, speaking words in languages that predated human speech. Worst of all was the sound, a constant, low humming that seemed to emanate from the breach itself, like the breathing of some vast and terrible entity. Magnus stepped through the portal and immediately felt the psychic pressure of the damaged space pressing against his mind. The webway here was wounded, infected, dying. The breach he had torn in its fabric years ago had never properly healed, and through that wound the energies of chaos continued to seep into humanity's greatest achievement. "How many demons?" he asked, as they moved deeper into the corrupted passage. "Uncountable," replied Custodian Aquilon, one of Valdor's most trusted companions. "They manifest in waves, drawn by the scent of order and humanity. We destroy them as they emerge, but more always follow. The Emperor maintains barriers that prevent them from reaching the palace proper, but the effort grows more taxing with each passing day." Magnus nodded grimly. He could feel his father's presence even here, could sense the vast psychic effort required to keep the wound from spreading further. It was like trying to hold back an ocean with bare hands, possible for a being of the Emperor's power, but not sustainable indefinitely. They moved deeper into the tunnel, passing blast marks and scorch patterns that spoke of countless battles fought in these impossible corridors. Custodians stood watch at regular intervals, their armor scarred by demon claws, and their faces grim with the weight of endless vigilance. These warriors had been holding this line for years, dying and being replaced in an endless cycle of sacrifice. The first demon materialized without warning, bursting from the wall in a shower of crystalline fragments and congealed malice. It was a thing of Tzinch, all writhing tentacles and burning eyes, and it moved with the fluid grace of living fire. Magnus reacted instinctively, his psychic might lashing out to bind the creature in place while Aquilon's guardian spear pierced its core. The demon's death scream echoed through the tunnel like breaking glass, and Magnus felt something twist in his stomach as he recognized the psychic resonance. He knew this creature. He had felt its birth in the moment when his warning tore through reality years ago. "I created that," he said, his voice hollow with realization. Valdor's helmet turned toward him, the Captain General's expression hidden behind his ornate faceplate. "All of this is your creation, Magnus of the Thousand Suns. The question now is whether you have the will to unmake it." They pressed on, deeper into the heart of the breach. The tunnel began to widen, and Magnus could see their destination ahead. A vast chamber where the webway's crystal walls gave way to a yawning void. This was ground zero, the point where his psychic sending had struck the Emperor's carefully constructed barriers and torn them apart like tissue paper. The chamber beyond was a testament to the Emperor's power and the magnitude of Magnus's failure. Psychic energy blazed in patterns too complex for mortal minds to follow, weaving barriers and containment fields that held back the raw stuff of chaos. At the center of it all sat a figure that Magnus recognized with a mixture of love and terror. The Emperor's physical form remained on the golden throne far above, but his psychic presence was here in its full, terrible glory. Magnus saw his father as he truly was, not the man-shaped figure that walked among mortals, but the burning star of human will that had guided their species from its earliest days. The sight was almost too much to bear. "My son," the Emperor's voice spoke directly into Magnus's mind, carrying with it the weight of millennia. "You have returned to finish what you began." Magnus stepped forward, feeling the psychic pressure in the chamber intensify with each movement. The air here was thick with possibilities, heavy with the potential for both creation and destruction. This was where the future of humanity would be decided, not in the throne room above, but in this wounded space between realities. "I remember the moment," Magnus said, his voice barely audible over the psychic storm. "I remember the desperation, the need to reach you before it was too late. I remember thinking that nothing could be more important than warning you of Horus's treachery. And you were not wrong," the Emperor replied, his mental voice carrying notes of both forgiveness and regret. "The warning was necessary. The method was unfortunate." Magnus reached out with his psychic senses, mapping the extent of the damage he had caused. The breach was massive, a tear in reality that went deeper than physical space. It was a wound in the concept of separation itself, a place where the distinction between real and unreal had been obliterated. "How do I fix this?" Magnus asked. "The same way it was broken," the Emperor said, "with will and purpose and the acceptance of consequences." Magnus understood. The breach had been created by his desperate desire to reach his father, by his willingness to tear through any barrier that stood in his way. To close it, he would need to reverse that intent, to choose separation over connection, to rebuild the barriers he had destroyed. He began to work, his psychic might flowing out in carefully controlled patterns. This was delicate work, requiring precision rather than raw power. Each thread of energy had to be woven into the webway's existing structure. Each patch had to seamlessly integrate with the crystalline matrix that formed the tunnel's walls. The demons came as he worked, drawn by the disturbance his efforts caused. Valdor and his custodians met them with blade and flame, their guardian spears carving through corrupted flesh, while Magnus maintained his focus on the breach. He could feel each demon's death, could sense the gradual weakening of Chaos's grip on this space. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time moved strangely in the webway, and Magnus lost himself in the rhythm of creation and restoration. Slowly, gradually, the wound began to close. The oily tears in the walls sealed themselves, the writhing shadows retreated, and the constant whispers faded to blessed silence. When it was finished, Magnus collapsed to his knees, his psychic reserves depleted by the monumental effort. The chamber around him had changed. The wild energies were contained now, controlled, channeled into patterns that spoke of order rather than chaos. The breach was not gone entirely, but it was sealed, contained, rendered harmless. "It is done," the Emperor said, and Magnus could hear something like pride in his father's voice. "The wound is closed. The webway is secure." Magnus nodded, too exhausted to speak. He had undone the greatest mistake of his long existence, had repaired the damage that had haunted him for years. It was not enough to balance the scales. Nothing could restore the lives lost or the opportunities squandered. But it was a beginning. Valdor approached, his guardian spear lowered in what might have been a gesture of respect. "The Captain General of the Custodes does not give trust lightly," he said formally. "But what you have accomplished here today speaks louder than any words could." Magnus looked up at the golden warrior, seeing something in his posture that had not been there before. Acceptance, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. "My father still requires protection," Magnus said, struggling to his feet. "And the siege continues above us. My work here is finished, but my service is not." As they made their way back through the restored tunnels, Magnus felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not realized he was carrying. The guilt would never fully leave him. Too much had been lost for that. But for the first time in years, he felt that he might truly be walking a path toward redemption. Above them, the war for Terra's soul continued. But here in the depths of the palace, one wrong had been made right. It was, Magnus thought, a start. Chapter 5. The War Master's Fury. The report came to Horus as he stood atop the command deck of the Vengeful Spirit, watching the Imperial Palace burn in the distance. The massive warship hung in Terra's poisoned sky like a predator savoring the moment before it struck, its hull scarred by months of warfare, but its weapons still hungry for destruction. From this vantage point, the War Master could see the scope of his achievement. The cradle of humanity reduced to a charnel house, its golden spires blackened with soot, and its magnificent plazas cratered by bombardment. He should have felt triumph. Instead, the words his herald spoke filled him with something far more familiar. Rage. "My lord." The word-bearer knelt as he delivered his message, his voice carefully neutral. "Our sources within the palace report that Magnus the Red has reconciled with the Emperor. The Crimson King fights now alongside the defenders." Horus said nothing for a long moment, his attention seemingly fixed on the distant walls where lasfire and plasma bursts painted the night in violent colors. When he finally turned to face the messenger, the herald involuntarily stepped backward. The War Master's eyes burned with an inner light that had nothing to do with the human soul that had once inhabited this body. "Say it again," Horus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Magnus the Red has betrayed us, my lord. He stands with Dawn and Sanguinius in defense of the palace." The sound that escaped Horus's throat was not quite human. It began as a growl and rose to something that might have been laughter, if laughter could carry the promise of genocide within it. The herald retreated further, his survival instincts screaming warnings that his training told him to ignore. "Betrayed," Horus repeated, as if testing the word's flavor. How interesting that he should choose that particular term. The War Master turned back to the viewing port, his massive frame silhouetted against the burning sky. In the reflection of the armored glass, the herald caught a glimpse of something that made his gene-enhanced heart skip a beat. For just a moment, Horus's face seemed to shift, revealing features that belonged to something ancient and terrible, something that had never been human at all. "Leave me," Horus said quietly. The herald fled with what dignity he could muster, leaving the War Master alone with his fury and his memories. Alone, Horus allowed himself to remember the Magnus he had known before the fall, the proud sorcerer king who had ruled Prospero with wisdom and justice, the brother who had sought knowledge above all else, who had delved into mysteries that others feared to contemplate. Magnus had been useful then, brilliant, powerful, and most importantly, desperate for approval from a father who had forbidden his greatest gifts. It had been almost laughably easy to turn him. The memory rose unbidden. Magnus standing in the ruins of Prospero after the Space Wolves' assault, his legion scattered and his home-world burning. The Crimson King had wept then, actually wept, as he surveyed the destruction of everything he had built. Horus had found him there, among the ashes of the great library, cradling the broken remains of a tome that had taken centuries to compile. "Brother," Horus had said, his voice carefully modulated, to carry both sympathy and authority. "I am sorry for what has transpired here." Magnus had looked up with eyes that burned with more than psychic fire. "Sorry? You orchestrated this, Horus. You told Russ that I had turned to chaos, that I needed to be brought back in chains, rather than simply called to account for my warning." "I told Russ what he needed to hear to ensure he acted decisively," Horus had replied, not bothering to deny the accusation. "Your warning about my change of allegiance was premature. The Emperor was not ready to hear such truths. Intervention was necessary." Intervention. Magnus had spat the word like a curse. "You destroyed my legion, my world, my life's work, and you call it intervention?" "I freed you," Horus had said simply, "from the Emperor's hypocrisy, from his lies about the nature of the warp, from his prohibition against the very gifts that make you extraordinary. Tell me, brother, in all your years of loyal service, did he ever once express gratitude for your sacrifices? Did he ever acknowledge that your understanding of psychic phenomena surpassed even his own?" That had been the moment. Horus could still remember the exact instant when Magnus's resistance had crumbled, when hurt and betrayal had opened the door for something darker to enter. The Crimson King had not fallen to chaos. He had been pushed, carefully and deliberately, by a brother who knew exactly which pressures to apply. And now that same brother dared to crawl back to their father's side. "Ezekiel," Horus called, his voice cutting through the bridge's ambient noise like a blade through silk. Abaddon materialized at his side with the silent efficiency that marked the First Company's elite. The future despoiler's black armor bore fresh battle damage from the latest assault on the palace's outer defenses, but his stance remained proud and uncompromising. "My lord, how goes the assault on the southern gate?" "Stalled," Abaddon reported with characteristic bluntness. "The defenders have rallied, and our intelligence suggests they have gained a new commander. Psychic shields are disrupting our demon engines, and our sorcerer auxiliaries report interference with their workings." Horus nodded slowly. Of course, Magnus would make his presence felt in such ways. The Crimson King's understanding of the warp's nature was perhaps the greatest in the galaxy, second only to the Emperor himself. His defection was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a strategic disaster that would cost thousands of lives and precious time they could not spare. "Redirect the bombardment," Horus commanded. "Civilian sectors 7 through 12. Maximum intensity." Abaddon's scarred features showed no emotion at the order, but Horus caught the slight hesitation before his lieutenant acknowledged. Even the Lunar Wolves' most brutal captain retained some vestige of the honor that had once defined their legion. "My lord," Abaddon said carefully, "those sectors contain refugee centers and medical facilities. The strategic value is irrelevant," Horus finished. "This is not about strategy, Ezekiel. This is about education." The War Master gestured toward the distant palace, where the golden spires still gleamed despite the devastation around them. Our wayward brother has chosen to stand with those who cast him out, who burned his world and slaughtered his sons. He thinks himself redeemed through this choice, cleansed of the taint of association with us. I intend to show him the true cost of redemption." Abaddon nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You wish him to feel the weight of every death his choice causes." "I wish him to understand that there is no going back," Horus said. "That his return to the Emperor's side has not saved anyone. It has merely guaranteed that their suffering will be more exquisite." The bombardment began within the hour. Horus stood at the viewing port and watched as lance strikes and plasma bombardments turned entire city blocks into funeral pyres. Each explosion bloomed like a flower of light against the darkness, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. He could imagine Magnus somewhere in the palace's depths, feeling each death through his psychic senses, knowing that his choice had purchased this slaughter. It was not enough. "Prepare the Justaerin for deployment," Horus ordered. "I want them accompanied by the full strength of our demon auxiliaries. Target the refugee convoys attempting to reach the palace's outer perimeter." "My lord." Horus turned to face his son, and Abaddon took an involuntary step backward. The thing looking out through the War Master's eyes was no longer even pretending to be human. "Magnus believes he can earn forgiveness through sacrifice and service," Horus said, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged in no human throat. "I intend to show him that some choices can never be unmade, that some stains can never be cleansed. Every civilian who dies fleeing toward the false sanctuary of the palace, every child who burns in the refugee camps, every old man who falls with his hands raised in surrender, their blood will be on his hands as surely as if he had wielded the blade himself." The War Master smiled, and the expression was perhaps the most terrible thing Abaddon had ever witnessed. "Let him have his redemption," Horus continued. "Let him serve faithfully at our father's side, knowing that his loyalty has purchased nothing but greater suffering for those he seeks to protect. Let him discover that there is no path back to innocence, no gesture grand enough to wash away the stain of what we have already done together." As if sensing his thoughts across the vast distance that separated them, Horus felt a familiar presence brush against his consciousness. Magnus, reaching out with his psychic senses, trying to understand the sudden escalation in the assault's brutality. The War Master opened his mind just enough to let his wayward brother sense the hatred and mockery directed at him, then slammed his mental defenses closed. Let the Crimson King rage and despair. Let him feel the weight of every choice, every consequence, every drop of blood that would flow because of his betrayal. There would be no clean endings in this war, no simple redemption for any of them. They had all fallen too far for that. The bombardment continued through the night, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. And somewhere in the depths of the Imperial Palace, Horus knew his wayward brother was beginning to understand the true cost of choosing loyalty over revenge. It was, the War Master thought, an excellent beginning. Chapter 6. Blood and Redemption. The Eternity Gate shuddered under the impact of 1,000 guns. Magnus felt each strike through the stones beneath his feet, through the psychic resonance that connected him to every part of the palace's vast structure. The ancient portal, wrought from adamantium and blessed by the Emperor's own hand, had withstood the fury of Xenos empires and the rage of demon princes. Now it faced its greatest test. From his position atop the gate's massive ramparts, Magnus could see the full scope of Horus's latest assault. The War Master had committed everything to this attack: traitor Astartes, demon engines, corrupted war machines that defied the laws of physics, and creatures summoned from the deepest pits of the warp. The air itself screamed with the sound of their approach. "The barriers are holding," reported Malkador the Sigillite, his ancient voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. The Emperor's right hand stood at Magnus's side, his staff glowing with psychic energy as he coordinated the palace's mystical defenses. But the pressure increases with each wave. Magnus nodded, his attention split between the approaching enemy and the complex web of psychic forces he helped maintain. Since the webway's repair, he had worked closely with Malkador to strengthen Terra's supernatural defenses. The old Sigillite had accepted his presence with the pragmatic grace of a man who understood that wars were won by using every available weapon. "They're targeting the gate's foundation," Magnus observed, watching as demon engines redirected their fire toward specific points in the ancient structure. "Someone is directing them with considerable tactical knowledge." "The question is who?" Malkador replied. "Few among the traitors understand the gate's construction well enough to identify such vulnerabilities." The answer came in the form of a psychic shriek that split the sky like breaking glass. Magnus felt the familiar presence before he saw it, a thing that had once been one of his own sons, twisted now into something barely recognizable. The creature that descended from the smoke-filled sky bore the colors of the 1,000 suns, but its flesh writhed with mutations that spoke of complete surrender to Tzeentch's will. "Ahriman," Magnus whispered, the name falling from his lips like a curse. But it was not his equerry who led the demon prince toward the gate. This had been Uthizar, the captain who had refused Magnus's final gift, who had fled rather than accept the cleansing death his primarch offered. Now he returned as something far worse than the mutated warrior he had been. "Father!" the demon prince shrieked, its voice carrying harmonics that belonged in no human throat. "Do you see what your redemption has purchased? Do you see what your loyalty has bought?" Magnus stepped forward to the rampart's edge, his hands crackling with psychic energy. Around him, imperial fists and blood angels opened fire on the approaching horror, their bolters spitting death into the smoke-choked air. The demon prince laughed as the shells passed harmlessly through its shifting form. "You cannot kill what is already dead," Uthizar continued, its form beginning to solidify as it drew closer to the gate. "You cannot redeem what has already fallen. We are your legacy, Magnus. We are what your choices have made us." The words hit Magnus like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of his guilt and grief. This thing wearing his son's face was right. He had created this horror through his choices, his pride, his desperate need for his father's approval. Every mutation, every corruption, every twisted feature was a consequence of decisions Magnus had made decades ago. "You speak truth," Magnus said, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "I did create you. I led you into corruption, into exile, into the embrace of chaos. For that, I will never forgive myself." The demon prince's laughter faltered slightly, as if it had expected denial rather than acknowledgement. "But," Magnus continued, his psychic might beginning to gather around him like a storm, "I also offer you what I offered before. Release. An end to suffering. Peace." "Peace!" Uthizar shrieked. "There is no peace for the damned, no redemption for the fallen, only eternal service to powers that care nothing for your mortal concerns." The demon prince struck then, its form blurring into motion, too fast for normal eyes to follow. Magnus met the attack with barriers of pure will, psychic shields that flared like newborn stars as they absorbed the creature's fury. Around them, the battle for the Eternity Gate continued, but Magnus found his attention narrowing to this single, personal confrontation. They fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. physically in the smoke-filled air above the gate, psychically in realms of pure thought, and spiritually in spaces where will and determination meant more than strength or speed. Magnus gave ground slowly, drawing the demon prince away from the gate's defenders, accepting wounds that would have killed a normal man in order to protect the warriors around him. "You cannot win," Uthazar hissed as its claws raked across Magnus's armor. "You are one aging Primarch against the endless fury of the warp itself. Your loyalty has made you weak." "My loyalty has made me purposeful," Magnus replied, countering with a psychic lance that pierced the demon prince's defenses. "You serve chaos because you were broken. I serve the Emperor because I choose to." The distinction mattered. Magnus could feel it in the way his powers responded, in the clarity of his focus, in the strength that flowed from certainty rather than desperation. This was not the Magnus who had bargained with Tzeentch on Sortiarius. This was not the broken king who had led his legion into exile. This was a Primarch who had chosen his side and committed himself completely to that choice. Uthazar sensed the change and redoubled its assault, summoning creatures from the warp to aid in its attack. Lesser demons materialized around them, their forms barely coherent in the material realm, but their malice unmistakable. Magnus destroyed them as they appeared, his psychic might lashing out in all directions while he continued his deadly dance with the thing that had been his son. The battle might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by a sound that made every warrior on the battlefield pause in recognition. Sanguinius's war cry echoed across the Eternity Gate as the angel descended from above, his wings spread wide and his sword blazing with inner light. The Blood Angel's Primarch had come to aid his brother, just as Magnus had come to aid the palace's defenders. But even a Primarch could be overwhelmed. Magnus watched in horror as a dozen demon engines turned their guns on the angel, filling the air with lass fire and plasma bursts. Sanguinius weathered the storm with superhuman grace, but Magnus could see the toll it was taking. One wing was already damaged, its feathers burned away by energy weapons. Blood ran from a dozen wounds across the angel's perfect features. Without conscious thought, Magnus acted. He reached out with his psychic might and wrapped Sanguinius in protective barriers, deflecting the incoming fire while simultaneously healing the angel's wounds. The effort left him momentarily vulnerable, and Uthazar struck with vicious efficiency. The demon prince's claws punched through Magnus's chest armor, the corrupted metal parting like silk before weapons forged in the warp itself. Magnus felt his blood flow, felt his strength begin to ebb, but he maintained his focus on protecting Sanguinius. Better that he should fall than allow another of his brothers to suffer for his choices. Sanguinius landed beside him with the fluid grace of a natural predator, his sword moving in patterns too beautiful and terrible to follow. The angel's blade found Uthazar's heart, or what passed for one in a creature that had abandoned physical form, and the demon prince dissolved with a shriek that shattered windows throughout the palace. "Brother," Sanguinius said, kneeling beside Magnus as the Crimson King struggled to remain upright. "Why did you spend your strength to heal me? Your wounds could have been avoided." Magnus looked up at the angel's perfect features and saw something there that he had not expected. Genuine concern, tinged with what might have been gratitude. When he spoke, his voice was thick with pain but clear in its conviction. "Because I have failed my sons, I will not fail my brothers." Sanguinius extended his hand, helping Magnus to his feet with a strength that belied his graceful appearance. "You did not fail me today, Magnus. You saved me. That is not failure, that is loyalty." Around them, the battle for the Eternity Gate continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Magnus could feel it in the way the Imperial defenders looked at him, in the set of their shoulders and the confidence of their movements. He was no longer the traitor, Primarch grudgingly accepted into their ranks. He was their brother in arms, proved in blood and sacrifice. Malcador approached, his ancient features showing something that might have been approval. "The demon incursions are weakening," he reported. "Whatever you did to that creature, it has disrupted their coordination significantly." Magnus nodded, understanding dawning in his mind. Uthazar had been more than just a fallen sun. It had been a focal point for the Chaos forces, a living link between the material realm and the powers that sought Terra's destruction. By destroying it, by choosing to protect Sanguinius rather than preserve his own strength, Magnus had struck a blow against the enemy's supernatural support. "The gate will hold," Magnus said with growing certainty. "Horus has shown his hand, and it is weaker than he hoped." Sanguinius smiled, the expression transforming his battle-scarred features into something radiant. "Then let us show him the cost of underestimating redeemed sinners." The angel spread his wings and took to the sky once more, his sword leading the Imperial counterattack against the reeling Chaos forces. Magnus watched him go, then turned his attention back to the mystical barriers that protected the gate. There was still work to do, still defenses to maintain, still redemption to earn. But for the first time since his return to Terra, Magnus felt truly certain of his path. The blood he had shed today was not wasted. The sacrifice he had made was not meaningless. He had saved a brother, protected the innocent, and struck a blow against the very forces that had once claimed him. It was, he thought, as he rejoined Malcador in coordinating the palace's defenses, exactly what a loyal son should do. Chapter 7. The Golden Vigil begins. The throne room of the Imperial Palace had always been vast, but now it felt infinite. Magnus stood before the Golden Throne itself, the massive device that had defined his father's existence for decades, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was about to occur. The chamber stretched away in all directions, its walls lost in shadows that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Here, at the heart of humanity's greatest citadel, reality bent to accommodate the will of gods. The Emperor sat motionless upon the throne, his form wreathed in energies that made looking directly at him a trial of endurance. Cables and conduits snaked from the ancient device into the depths of the palace, carrying the psychic power that kept the webway sealed and the Astronomicon burning. For years this had been his prison as much as his seat of power. Soon it would be Magnus's. "The time has come," the Emperor said, his voice resonating through both air and psyche. "Horus grows desperate. He will lower his shield soon, seeking to draw me into personal combat aboard the vengeful spirit. It is an opportunity that cannot be ignored." Magnus nodded, though his attention was divided between his father's words and the overwhelming presence of the Golden Throne itself. He could feel the device's hunger, its need for a psyker of immense power to feed its systems. It called to him with the promise of unity, perfect synchronization between human will and cosmic machinery. "You understand what this means," the Emperor continued. "Once you take the throne, there will be no going back. The vigil I have maintained will become yours. The burden I have carried will rest upon your shoulders." "I understand," Magnus replied, though he suspected his understanding was incomplete. How could any mind truly grasp the scope of what the Emperor had endured? The constant pressure of maintaining the webway's integrity, of powering the beacon that guided ships through the warp, of holding back the tide of chaos through sheer force of will. It was a responsibility that would have broken lesser beings in moments. The Emperor rose from the golden throne with movements that seemed to cost him considerable effort. The cables and conduits that connected him to the device began to withdraw, their departure accompanied by fluctuations in the chamber's ambient energy that made Magnus's teeth ache. For a moment, the Astronomicon flickered, its light wavering as its primary focus shifted. "Father," Magnus said, stepping forward as the Emperor swayed slightly. "The strain will pass to you shortly," the Emperor finished, his voice carrying notes of both relief and regret. "I have maintained this vigil for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand apart from the throne. The sensation is disconcerting." Magnus caught his father's arm as the Emperor stepped down from the massive device, feeling the incredible heat that radiated from his flesh. The Emperor was burning from within, his physical form barely containing the psychic energies that had sustained the Imperium for decades. It was a miracle he had endured as long as he had. "My son," the Emperor said, turning to face Magnus directly. For the first time since their reunion in the psychic realm, Magnus saw his father not as the master of mankind, but simply as a being who had carried an impossible burden for far too long. "I must tell you something before I go to face Horus." Magnus waited, sensing the weight of unspoken words. "When you broke the webway with your warning, I was furious," the Emperor continued. "Not merely at the damage you caused, but at the implications of that damage. I saw my great work destroyed, saw the future I had planned for humanity crumbling into ruin. In my anger, I said things that drove you into exile, into the very arms of the powers I sought to protect you from." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross. Magnus felt tears he had not shed since childhood, threatening to spill from his eyes. "I was wrong," the Emperor said simply. "My anger was justified, but my response was not. I should have understood that your warning, however destructive in its delivery, came from love. I should have seen that your greatest crime was caring too much, not too little." "Father," Magnus began, but the Emperor raised a hand to forestall him. "No, let me finish. You have paid a price for your mistakes that far exceeds their magnitude. You have sacrificed your sons, accepted exile, endured corruption and purification alike, all in service to the greater good. You have proven yourself worthy of the redemption I once thought impossible." The Emperor stepped closer, placing his hands on Magnus's shoulders with a gentleness that seemed impossible from fingers that had wielded the power of stars. "I am proud of you, my son, not for what you were, but for what you have become." The words broke something in Magnus that had been rigid with guilt and self-recrimination for decades. He sank to one knee before his father, not in submission, but in the simple acknowledgement of a love he had thought forever lost. "I will not fail you again," Magnus whispered. "You will not fail because you understand the true nature of failure now," the Emperor replied. "You know that good intentions without wisdom can cause more damage than malicious action. You know that love without restraint can become a weapon against those we seek to protect. Most importantly, you know that redemption is not a destination, but a choice we make with every breath." The Emperor helped Magnus to his feet, then gestured toward the golden throne. "Are you ready?" Magnus looked at the massive device, feeling its psychic pull intensify as he approached. The throne was beautiful in its terrible complexity, golden spires and crystal matrices that seemed to extend into dimensions beyond human perception. It was a fusion of technology and sorcery that represented the apex of human achievement. and it would be his home for the rest of eternity. "I am ready," he said. The process of connection was unlike anything Magnus had experienced, even in his deepest explorations of the warp. The Golden Throne did not simply accept his psychic energy, it merged with it, creating a symbiosis that transcended the merely physical. Magnus felt his consciousness expand until it encompassed not just his own body, but the entire structure of the Imperial Palace, then beyond to the webway tunnels that stretched across the galaxy, then further still to the beacon of the Astronomicon itself. He was everywhere and nowhere, a single point of awareness scattered across light years of space. Through the webway, he could sense the pulse of human civilizations on distant worlds. Through the Astronomicon, he could feel the prayers of ship crews lost in the warp's chaotic currents. Through the throne itself, he could touch the dreams and fears of every human soul in the galaxy. The weight of it was overwhelming. Magnus understood now why his father had seemed so distant, so removed from individual concerns. When your awareness encompassed billions of lives, when every decision you made could affect the fate of entire worlds, the luxury of personal feeling became both impossible and irrelevant. But Magnus was not his father. Where the Emperor had sought to guide humanity through pure logic and calculated strategy, Magnus brought something different to the throne. He brought understanding of failure, knowledge of redemption, and the hard-won wisdom that came from having lost everything and chosen to continue anyway. "I see," Magnus whispered, though he was no longer entirely sure if he was speaking aloud or simply thinking into the vast network of the throne's consciousness. "I see the pattern." Through his expanded awareness, Magnus watched his father prepare for the final confrontation with Horus. He saw the Emperor don his ancient armor, saw him take up weapons that had not been drawn since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. He felt his father's determination and his grief, for Horus had been beloved above all the other Primarchs, and killing him would be like tearing out the Emperor's own heart. But it had to be done. Magnus could see the futures that branched out from this moment, could trace the consequences of action and inaction alike. If Horus was not stopped here, if his rebellion was not crushed completely, then everything they had fought for would be lost. The Imperium would fragment, humanity would fall to chaos, and the galaxy would become a playground for powers that viewed mortal suffering as entertainment. "Go," Magnus said, his voice carrying across dimensions to reach his father's ears. "I will hold the line here. I will maintain the throne, guard the webway, and keep the beacon burning. Whatever happens aboard the vengeful spirit, humanity will not be left defenseless." The Emperor's response came not as words, but as a wave of emotion, gratitude, love, and the bittersweet recognition that this was both a beginning and an ending. Father and son would never speak again as they had in the psychic realm. Magnus was part of something larger now, a component in the vast machine that kept humanity alive among the stars. As the Emperor departed for his final battle, Magnus settled deeper into the Golden Throne's embrace. He felt the device's systems responding to his presence, felt the webway's barriers strengthen, and the Astronomicon's light burn brighter. Through it all, he maintained his sense of self. Not the broken exile who had fled to Sortiarius, not the proud sorcerer king of Prospero, but something new, something redeemed. He was Magnus the Red, guardian of the Golden Throne, keeper of the webway, and light in the darkness. He had found his purpose at last, and it was exactly what his father had always intended it to be. The vigil had begun. Chapter 8. The Emperor's Final Battle. From his seat upon the Golden Throne, Magnus felt his father's presence ascending through layers of reality toward the vengeful spirit. The Emperor moved through the warp like a star cutting through darkness, his psychic signature blazing with such intensity that lesser beings would have been incinerated by proximity alone. Through their connection, forged by blood, by purpose, and now by the throne itself, Magnus experienced every step of that fateful journey. The ancient systems of the Golden Throne hummed around him, their crystalline matrices pulsing with energies that had sustained the Imperium for decades. Magnus had learned to navigate their complexity with growing confidence, but now he pushed the device beyond its normal parameters. If his father was walking into the final confrontation that would determine humanity's fate, then Magnus would ensure he did not walk alone. "I can feel you, my son," the Emperor's voice whispered across dimensions, carrying notes of both gratitude and concern. "Do not overextend yourself. The throne's primary functions mustn't be compromised." "They won't be," Magnus replied, his consciousness split between maintaining the webway's integrity and following his father's progress. "But you will not face this alone. Not again." The vengeful spirit materialized around the Emperor's ascending form like a nightmare given substance. Once, the massive battle barge had been the pride of the lunar wolves, its halls echoing with the laughter of warriors and the wisdom of remembrancers. Now it was something else, entirely. A vessel so thoroughly corrupted by chaos that its very structure defied the laws of physics. The ship's corridors writhed with mutations that spoke in voices, its walls wept substances that were not blood, and its air carried whispers in languages that predated human speech. Magnus felt his father's disgust as the Emperor walked through passages that had once rung with the voices of beloved sons. This ship had been Horus's home for centuries, the place where he had held court as the greatest of the Primarchs. To see it transformed into this abomination was perhaps more painful than any physical wound could have been. The journey to the ship's heart was not unopposed. Demons manifested from the corrupted walls, creatures of such fundamental wrongness that their presence alone was an assault on reality. But they could not touch the Emperor. His will burned through them like sunlight through shadow, reducing them to screaming wisps before they could even approach his radiance. Magnus aided where he could, using the Golden Throne's vast power to strengthen his father's psychic barriers and disrupt the ship's attempts at supernatural interference. Each pulse of assistance drained him, but he maintained his focus with the discipline learned through decades of psychic mastery. The webway held, the Astronomicon burned bright. The throne's primary functions continued uninterrupted. Finally, the Emperor reached the command deck where Horus waited. The thing that had been the War Master was barely recognizable. Magnus felt his father's grief like a physical blow as they both beheld what chaos had made of the beloved son. Horus's form had grown massive, his armor fused with flesh that writhed with its own malevolent intelligence. 4 marks adorned his grotesquely expanded frame, the symbols of the ruinous powers that had claimed him completely. His eyes burned with fires that belonged in no human skull, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that spoke of entropy and despair. "Father," Horus said, the word twisted into something obscene. "You have come at last. I wondered if you would find the courage to face what your neglect has created." "What my love created," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying the weight of infinite sorrow, "and what my love must now destroy." The battle that followed transcended physical combat. Father and son fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously, their conflict playing out in realms of pure thought, spaces where emotion took tangible form, and realities where will itself was the only weapon that mattered. Magnus experienced it all through his connection to the Emperor, felt every blow given and received, witnessed every moment of their cosmic duel. Horus was immensely powerful. The dark gods had poured their strength into him, making him their avatar in the material realm. His attacks came not just as physical force, but as conceptual assaults. The idea of betrayal given form, the notion of despair made manifest, the very concept of endings wielded as a weapon. Each strike was designed not merely to wound, but to corrupt, to transform the Emperor into something as twisted as Horus himself had become. But the Emperor was more than powerful. He was purposeful. Every move was calculated, every defense was precise, every counterattack was delivered with the accumulated wisdom of 40,000 years. Where Horus fought with the fury of the damned, the Emperor fought with the calm determination of one who had accepted the cost of victory before the battle began. Magnus fed power to his father through their connection, carefully modulating his assistance to avoid disrupting the delicate balance of forces in play. He felt the Emperor's gratitude for the aid, but also his concern that Magnus was pushing himself too hard. The Golden Throne demanded constant attention, and any lapse in concentration could have catastrophic consequences. "Hold the line at Terra," the Emperor commanded, as Horus pressed another devastating assault. "Whatever happens here, the throne must not fail." "It won't," Magnus promised, though the strain of maintaining both his duties and his assistance was beginning to tell. "But neither will you. I have already lost one father to my mistakes. I will not lose another to my inaction." The turning point came when Horus overextended himself, pouring so much of the dark god's power into a single attack that his mortal form began to destabilize. The Emperor seized the opportunity with the reflexes of a warrior who had fought wars before humanity learned to use tools. His psychic might lanced out like a spear of pure order, piercing through Horus's defenses and striking at the core of what made the War Master more than human. Magnus felt the moment of contact, felt his father's power burning through Horus's corrupted essence like acid through metal. The War Master's scream echoed across dimensions, carrying with it the death cries of the demon entities that had claimed him. For just an instant, the thing that had been Horus flickered, and Magnus glimpsed something that might have been the beloved brother he remembered, confused, horrified by what he had become, and grateful for release. Then the moment passed, and Horus fell. But victory came at a terrible price. The Emperor's form was broken, his immortal flesh torn by wounds that went deeper than the merely physical. As he collapsed beside his fallen son, Magnus felt the damage through their connection, not just to his body, but to his very essence. The Emperor was dying, his vast consciousness beginning to fragment under the strain of what he had endured. "Father!" Magnus reached out with his psychic might, pouring healing energy through their connection, despite the drain it placed on the Golden Throne's systems. "Hold on. I can stabilize you. I can—" "No." The Emperor's voice was growing faint, but it carried absolute authority. "The throne requires your full attention now. I will endure long enough to return to Terra. What happens after that is beyond my power to determine." Magnus felt tears streaming down his face as he sensed his father's fading presence. The Emperor was using the last of his strength to return to Terra, to reach the palace where he could be placed in the life support systems that might preserve some fragment of his consciousness. But Magnus knew, with the terrible clarity that came from complete psychic connection, that the man who had guided humanity for millennia was dying. "You are ready," the Emperor whispered, as his presence grew ever more distant. You have proven yourself worthy of the throne, worthy of the trust I place in you. Humanity's future rests in capable hands." "I'm not ready," Magnus said, his voice breaking with grief. "I can't do this without you. I don't know how to guide an entire species." "You will learn," the Emperor replied, his mental voice now barely audible. "As I learned. As all guardians must learn. Through necessity, through sacrifice, and through love of what we protect." The connection faded as the Emperor's transport approached Terra's surface. Magnus felt his father's presence settling into the life support systems that would become his tomb, felt the ancient machinery taking over the burden of keeping the master of mankind's consciousness tethered to the material realm. The Emperor lived, but he lived as something barely more than a whisper, a shadow of his former self. Alone upon the golden throne, Magnus wept for his father, for his fallen brother, and for the innocents that had died along with the Horus heresy. The great rebellion was over, crushed by a victory that felt more like defeat. The Emperor survived, but as a broken thing sustained only by machinery and will. Horus was dead, taking with him the dream of a unified family of primarchs serving their father's vision. But the Imperium endured. The webway held. The Astronomicon burned bright, guiding ships safely through the warp. And on the golden throne, a redeemed son took up the burden his father could no longer carry. The age of the Emperor was ending. The age of Magnus the Guardian had begun. And in the depths of the palace, surrounded by the humming machinery of divinity, Magnus the Red settled into his eternal vigil. There would be time for grief later. Now there was only duty, and the endless task of shepherding humanity through the darkness that lay ahead. The price of victory, Magnus realized, was not measured in lives lost or worlds burned. It was measured in the willingness to carry on when carrying on seemed impossible. He would carry on, for his father, for humanity, for the future they had all sacrificed so much to preserve. Chapter 9. The Throne. Eternal. The Emperor's return to Terra was both triumph and tragedy. Magnus felt his father's presence as the broken form was carried into the depths of the palace, felt the careful hands of the Adeptus Mechanicus as they worked to integrate the dying god into the life support systems that would preserve what remained of his consciousness. The Emperor lived, but it was a form of existence that could barely be called life. From his seat upon the golden throne, Magnus watched through psychic senses as the massive apparatus was constructed around his father's ruined body. The life support machinery was a wonder of technology and desperation, golden tubes and crystalline matrices that would sustain the Emperor's failing flesh while amplifying whatever psychic strength remained to him. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a monument to the price of victory over chaos. "My son," the Emperor's voice came to Magnus through their connection, far weaker than it had been, but still carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The transition begins now. Are you prepared to assume the full burden?" Magnus felt the weight of the question settle into his consciousness like gravity. For weeks, he had been learning to operate the Golden Throne, to maintain the webway's integrity while powering the Astronomicon. But his father's presence had always been there, a steady guide helping to bear the impossible load. Now that presence was fading, becoming something more like an echo than an active force. "I am prepared," Magnus said, though the words felt like a prayer rather than a certainty. "Good. The Imperium will need guidance in the days to come. Malkador has called together the High Lords to establish new systems of governance. You must work with them, but remember, you are not their servant. You are humanity's guardian, and your authority in matters of the warp and the webway is absolute." Magnus nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into his understanding. The Golden Throne was more than just a prison or a power source. It was the nexus through which humanity's psychic future would be shaped. From this seat, he could guide the species' evolution, protect them from the predations of chaos, and open pathways through the galaxy that would free them from dependence on the warp. The first test came within hours of the Emperor's integration into the life support systems. Malkador the Sigillite arrived in the throne room, accompanied by figures Magnus recognized as the soon-to-be High Lords of Terror, military commanders, tech priests and administrators who would reshape the Imperium's governance in the Emperor's absence. Their faces showed a mixture of awe and uncertainty as they approached the Golden Throne. "Lord Magnus," Malkador said, his ancient voice carrying the weariness of millennia, "the Imperium must be reorganized. The Emperor's direct rule is no longer possible, but his will must still be carried out. We seek your guidance in establishing the new order." Magnus looked down at the assembled figures, feeling the weight of their expectations. These were capable beings, each a master of their chosen domain. But they were also frightened. The foundation of their world had been shaken by the heresy, and now they faced an uncertain future without the Emperor's direct guidance. "The Emperor's vision remains unchanged," Magnus said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "Humanity must be protected from the predations of chaos, guided toward a future free from dependence on the warp, and united in purpose despite the vastness of the galaxy. How you achieve this is your choice. My role is to maintain the infrastructure that makes it possible." As if to emphasize his words, Magnus reached out through the Golden Throne systems and activated one of the newly repaired webway gates. The ancient portal, thought lost for millennia, blazed to life with energies that made the air itself sing. Through it, the assembled lords could see a corridor of crystallized possibility stretching toward distant stars. "The webway is restored," Magnus continued. "Humanity can once again travel the galaxy without touching the realm of chaos. Use this gift wisely, and the Imperium will flourish as never before. Abuse it, and I will seal the gates until wiser minds prevail." The threat was delivered gently, but its implications were clear. Magnus was not merely offering assistance. He was establishing the terms under which that assistance would be provided. The High Lords exchanged glances, recognition dawning in their eyes that the balance of power in the Imperium had fundamentally shifted. Over the following weeks, Magnus threw himself into mastering the full scope of his new responsibilities. The Golden Throne systems were vast beyond imagining, their complexity requiring constant attention and adjustment. Through them, he could sense the pulse of human civilization across the galaxy. Billions of souls going about their daily lives, unaware that their continued existence depended on the vigilance of a single redeemed Primarch. The Astronomicon required the most delicate touch. The great beacon that guided ships through the warp was powered by the souls of psychers. Their life force burned away to maintain the light that kept humanity connected. Magnus found the process deeply disturbing, but he understood its necessity. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium would fragment into isolated worlds, prey to any enemy that possessed faster-than-light travel. But the beacon could be refined, made more efficient. Using knowledge gained from his years of studying the warp's nature, Magnus began implementing subtle modifications to the Astronomicon's structure. The changes would take decades to complete, but eventually they would reduce the number of psyker souls required to maintain the beacon while increasing its range and clarity. The webway offered even greater possibilities. As Magnus explored the restored network, he found pathways that led to distant sectors of the galaxy, routes that could connect imperial worlds without requiring ships to brave the warp's dangers. Some gates opened to systems that had been isolated, since the dark age of technology. Others led to regions where human colonies had survived in isolation, maintaining fragments of lost knowledge and culture. A signal from the Coronis system, Magnus reported during one of his regular communications with the High Lords. 3 worlds, approximately 40,000 colonists total. They report compliance with our imperial authority, but have been out of contact for over 2,000 years. They possess intact STC templates for agricultural machinery. The news sent ripples of excitement through the assembled administrators. Standard template constructs were treasures beyond price, containing blueprints for technology that could revolutionize entire sectors. The ability to reach such isolated systems safely through the webway, rather than risking warp travel, made the difference between hope and certainty. But with each success, Magnus felt the weight of his isolation more keenly. He sat alone upon the golden throne, connected to billions of minds, but truly intimate with none of them. His father's presence had faded to little more than a whisper, available for consultation in dire emergencies, but no longer capable of meaningful conversation. His brothers were scattered across the galaxy, dealing with their own responsibilities and traumas. The 1,000 sons were dead, their knowledge and companionship lost forever. In his darker moments, Magnus wondered if this was punishment rather than redemption, eternal service without the comfort of true companionship, perfect awareness of humanity's struggles without the ability to directly intervene in most of them. The Golden Throne was simultaneously the most powerful position in the galaxy and the most lonely. Those doubts were tested when the first major crisis of the new era arrived. A warp storm in the Segmentum Solar threatened to cut off several important hive worlds, potentially stranding billions of Imperial citizens without supply lines or communication. Normally, such an event would have required massive military operations to establish safe corridors through the storm, operations that would have cost thousands of ships and millions of lives. Instead, Magnus simply opened a new series of webway gates. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Supply convoys that would have taken months to force their way through the warp storm reached their destinations in days. Communication with the threatened worlds was restored instantly. Most importantly, the precedent was established that the Imperium now had alternatives to warp travel in times of crisis. Remarkable, breathed Fabricator General Zagreus Kane as he reviewed the operation's results. Lord Magnus, the implications of what you have accomplished cannot be overstated. We are no longer entirely dependent on the warp for faster-than-light travel. Magnus nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction that was tempered by awareness of how much work remained. The webway network was vast, but much of it remained damaged or unexplored. Restoring it to full functionality would be the work of centuries, requiring not just his own efforts, but the cooperation of the entire Imperium. This is only the beginning, he told the assembled High Lords. The Emperor's vision was of humanity free from the warp's influence, able to travel the galaxy without fear of chaos corruption. That vision is achievable, but it will require dedication from all of us. As the months passed, the new pattern of governance settled into routine. The High Lords managed the Imperium's day-to-day operations, while Magnus maintained the psychic infrastructure that made their authority meaningful. It was not perfect. There were conflicts over resource allocation, disagreements about priorities, and the inevitable power struggles that arose when authority was divided among multiple institutions. But it worked. The Imperium not only survived the transition from the Emperor's direct rule, but began to flourish in ways that would have been impossible during the chaos of the heresy. Trade routes that had been severed for decades were re-established through the webway. Isolated colonies were brought back into contact with the greater Imperium. Most importantly, humanity's psychers began receiving proper training rather than being hunted as witches or left to their own devices. Magnus established the first webway academies, institutions where human psychers could learn to safely navigate the crystalline passages without risking corruption. The knowledge came from his own hard-won understanding of how to touch the warp without being touched by it in return. It was, he thought, a better legacy than the broken promises and failed experiments that had defined his previous attempts at teaching. Late at night, when the throne room was empty except for the ever-present custodians, Magnus would sometimes reach out through the webway to touch the minds of his students. He felt their wonder as they learned to walk safely through realms of crystallized possibility, their relief as they discovered they were not doomed to corruption or madness, their determination to use their gifts in service of something greater than themselves. It was not the same as the brotherhood he had shared with the 1,000 suns. Nothing could replace that, but it was something worthwhile, a chance to guide rather than command, to teach without demanding absolute loyalty, to offer hope instead of false promises. In those quiet moments, Magnus allowed himself to believe that his father's vision might actually be achievable. Humanity freed from dependence on the warp, traveling the galaxy through pathways of pure order, guided by psychers who understood both the power and the responsibility that came with their gifts. It would take time. It would require sacrifices that few could imagine. But sitting upon the golden throne, feeling the pulse of human civilization flowing through pathways of crystallized light, Magnus the Red believed it could be done, and he would be there to see it through, for as long as humanity needed a guardian in the darkness between the stars. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Fallen. The first manifestation appeared during the deep watches of the night, when the throne room lay empty except for the eternal vigilance of the custodian guard. Magnus had been adjusting the Astronomican's frequency to better accommodate a new class of psyker navigators when he felt a familiar presence brush against his consciousness. He looked up from the golden throne's crystalline displays to see a figure standing in the shadows between the great columns. Ahriman. The apparition was perfect in every detail. The ornate Terminator armor with its intricate hieroglyphs, the feathered crest that marked his rank as chief librarian, even the slight cant to his head that had always indicated deep thought. But this was not the corrupted demon prince that Uthizar had become. This was Ahriman as he had been in life, before mutation and madness had claimed the 1,000 suns. "My lord," the spectre said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone that had marked their centuries of service together. "You seem troubled." Magnus felt his breath catch. Through the golden throne systems, he could sense the psychic resonance of the manifestation. It was not an external entity, but a projection from his own mind, a fragment of memory and guilt given semi-autonomous form. The knowledge did not make it any less real or any less painful. "Arzek," Magnus whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The spectre of his equerry stepped closer, his movements carrying the fluid grace that had made him one of the finest warriors in the Legion. "For what, my lord? For saving us from damnation? For giving us peace?" "For killing you," Magnus said, his voice breaking with the weight of accumulated grief. "For choosing redemption over loyalty to my sons." Ahriman's ghost smiled, the expression both infinitely sad and strangely comforting. "You chose correctly, father. We were already dead, had been dead since the moment we fled to the planet of sorcerers. What you gave us was not death, but release." Magnus wanted to believe those words, but the guilt that had eaten at him for months refused to be so easily dismissed. Each night brought new manifestations, Sobek appearing to discuss tactical implications of the webway's restoration, Phosis Takar questioning him about the new psyker training protocols, Hathor Mat simply standing in silent witness to his vigil. They were all products of his own psyche, he knew, but they felt real enough to touch. "The irony is not lost on me," Magnus said during one such visitation, addressing the assembled spectres of his fallen legion. "I spent centuries seeking knowledge, pursuing understanding, believing that wisdom alone could solve any problem. In the end, the answer required the abandonment of knowledge, the willing destruction of everything I had learned and taught." "Not abandonment," Amon's shade corrected, his form flickering like candlelight as he gestured toward the webway gates that hummed with contained power. "Transformation. The knowledge we gathered, the understanding we achieved, it lives on in what you do here. Every psyker you guide safely through the webway carries a fragment of our legacy. Every soul you protect from chaos corruption honors our sacrifice." It was true, Magnus realized. The first generation of webway-trained psykers was showing remarkable progress in their studies. Unlike the traditional methods of psyker training, which relied heavily on suppression and fear, Magnus's approach emphasized understanding and cooperation with psychic forces. Students learned to navigate the crystalline passages of the webway before they ever touched the raw chaos of the warp, building confidence and skill in an environment where failure meant confusion rather than damnation. "Report from the Vesperian Academies," announced Epistolary Thaler, one of the new generation of psykers who served as Magnus's direct liaisons with the training facilities. The young man approached the golden throne with the careful reverence that all students showed their primarch, his psychic signature bright with enthusiasm and purpose. "Graduation rates continue to improve. The new protocols you established have reduced corruption incidents by 73%. Magnus felt a surge of satisfaction at the news. The protocols in question were based on hard-won understanding of how chaos entities infiltrated human consciousness, knowledge purchased with the suffering of his own sons. Every successful graduation was a vindication of their sacrifice, proof that their pain had not been meaningless. "What of the deep webway expeditions?" Magnus asked, shifting his attention to another aspect of the growing program. 6 new gates activated this month, Thale reported. The expedition to the Ghoul Stars has established contact with 17 isolated human colonies. They report intact STC fragments for plasma weapon maintenance and agricultural enhancement. More importantly, they've maintained genetic purity despite millennia of isolation. The implications were staggering. For 10,000 years, human colonies had been struggling to maintain their technology and genetic integrity without support from Terra. The fact that so many had succeeded spoke to the resilience of the human spirit and the wisdom of the Emperor's original vision. Through the webway, these lost fragments of humanity could be reunited with the greater Imperium, their knowledge and culture preserved for future generations. But success brought its own burdens. As Magnus's consciousness expanded through the webway network, he began to encounter traces of his fallen sons in the most unexpected places. A particular crystalline formation reminded him of Sobek's tactical displays. A harmonic resonance in the webway's structure echoed the way Ahriman had hummed while calculating psychic equations. Most painful of all were the moments when he detected faint psychic imprints, echoes of his son's presence from their early explorations of the network decades ago. "You carry us with you," Ahriman's spectre observed during one particularly difficult vigil. "Not as burdens, but as teachers. Every lesson we learned, every mistake we made, every moment of understanding we achieved, it shapes how you guide the next generation." Magnus nodded slowly, beginning to understand what his equerry meant. The new psychers were not replacements for the 1,000 suns. Nothing could be that. But they were inheritors of the Legion's true legacy, the accumulated wisdom of warriors, scholars who had dedicated their lives to understanding the cosmos's deeper mysteries. "Tell me about the Korvax colony expedition," Magnus said, addressing Thale directly. The young psycher's expression grew somber. "A cautionary tale, my lord. The colony had attempted to create their own psyker training program using fragments of recovered knowledge. Without proper understanding of the principles involved, they opened themselves to corruption," Magnus finished, feeling the familiar weight of preventable tragedy. "How many lost?" 300 souls, my lord. But we were able to evacuate the remaining population and establish proper protocols. The survivors are being retrained using our methods." Magnus closed his eyes and reached out through the Golden Throne systems to touch the minds of those survivors. He felt their fear and confusion, their guilt at having lost loved ones to the very powers they had tried to master. It was a mirror of his own experience. Good intentions corrupted by insufficient understanding, noble goals twisted into tragic failure. But there was hope as well. Under proper guidance, the survivors from Korvax were learning to channel their psychic abilities safely. They would carry the memory of their loss forward, using it to teach others the importance of proper training and careful restraint. Their tragedy would prevent future tragedies. "This is why we matter," Phocis Takar's ghost observed, his young face showing wisdom far beyond his apparent years. "Not because we were perfect, but because we were cautionary examples. Our failures teach as much as our successes." The truth of that observation settled into Magnus's consciousness like a foundation stone. The 1,000 suns had not died in vain if their story served to guide future generations away from the same mistakes. Every psyker who learned proper discipline, every student who understood the dangers of unchecked ambition, every teacher who emphasized wisdom over raw power, they all carried forward the true legacy of his fallen legion. "Incoming transmission from the Macarian sector," announced another aide, her voice cutting through Magnus's contemplation. "Admiral Crassus reports successful establishment of 3 new webway nodes. Travel time to the sector capital has been reduced from 6 months to 6 days. Magnus smiled at the news. The strategic implications were profound. Defense of distant sectors would no longer require years of travel time for reinforcements. Trade routes that had been vulnerable to pirates and Xenos raiders could now be secured within days rather than months. Most importantly, isolated worlds would no longer face the despair of complete abandonment during times of crisis. "And the psychic resonance in those new nodes?" Magnus asked. "Clean, my lord. No signs of warp contamination or demon activity. Your purification protocols are holding perfectly." That was perhaps the most important achievement of all. The original webway network had been vulnerable to chaos corruption precisely because it lacked proper psychic defenses. Magnus's modifications, based on understanding gained through his own fall and redemption, created nodes that actively repelled malevolent entities while remaining completely accessible to human consciousness. As the night wore on and the reports continued to flow in, Magnus found himself thinking less about what he had lost and more about what he was building. The 1,000 suns were gone, but their knowledge lived on in every successful expedition, every properly trained psyker, every world brought safely into the Imperium's embrace through the restored webway. "Do you see it now?" Ahriman's spectre asked, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the throne room's crystal windows. "The golden age we dreamed of is not a memory. It is a possibility. Our sacrifice was not the end of our work, but the foundation for its completion." Magnus felt tears streaming down his face as he looked around the throne room. The ghostly forms of his sons stood in silent ranks before the golden throne, their faces showing not accusation, but approval. They had followed him into exile, into corruption, into death itself. Now they would follow him into whatever came next, not as the broken remnants of a fallen legion, but as the guiding spirits of humanity's psychic ascension. "Thank you," Magnus whispered, addressing not just the spectres of his imagination, but the memory of every 1,000 son who had ever served under his command, "for your loyalty, for your sacrifice, for showing me that redemption is not about forgetting the past, but about transforming it into something worthy of the price that was paid." The manifestations began to fade as daylight filled the chamber, but Magnus could still feel their presence, not as guilt or grief, but as purpose. His sons lived on in every lesson taught, every danger prevented, every soul guided safely through the perils of psychic awakening. He was no longer Magnus the fallen, the traitor, the kinslayer. He was Magnus the teacher, the guardian, the builder of humanity's future. And in that transformation, his sons had found their own form of immortality. The golden throne hummed with renewed purpose as Magnus settled deeper into his eternal vigil, ready to guide humanity toward the destiny his sacrifice had made possible. Chapter 11. The Red Primarch's Vision. 7 years had passed since Magnus first took his place upon the golden throne, and the galaxy bore the marks of his stewardship. From his seat at the nexus of humanity's psychic network, he could perceive the Imperium's transformation with perfect clarity. Trade routes that hummed with peaceful commerce, worlds that no longer lived in fear of isolation, and most remarkably, a generation of psychers who served without corruption or madness. The latest reports spread before his consciousness like a vast tapestry of light. Through the webway's crystalline passages, Imperial expeditionary fleets moved with unprecedented speed and safety. What had once been a journey of months through the treacherous currents of the warp was now accomplished in days through pathways of pure order. The implications were staggering, and the results spoke for themselves. "Expedition Report Tertius 7, announced Librarian Prime Calith, one of the new generation of psychers who had been trained entirely within Magnus's reformed system. The young woman approached the golden throne with the confident stride of someone who had never known fear of her own abilities. Successful contact with the Hadrian cluster. 7 worlds, 200 million souls, all reporting full compliance and eager reintegration. Magnus nodded, feeling a surge of satisfaction that had become increasingly common. The Hadrian cluster had been cut off from the Imperium for over 3,000 years, surviving through careful resource management and technological preservation. Their reintegration through the webway would add valuable industrial capacity to the Imperium's growing strength. "What of their technological status?" Magnus asked, his attention split between the conversation and the 1,000 other demands on his awareness. "Remarkable preservation, my lord," Calith replied, her excitement barely contained. "They've maintained STC patterns for advanced agricultural systems and water purification technology. More importantly, they've developed refinements to both that could benefit billions across the Imperium." The discovery of lost technology had become almost routine as webway expeditions reached ever more distant corners of the galaxy. Isolated human colonies, cut off from the larger Imperium by warp storms and Xenos predation, had often preserved knowledge that had been lost elsewhere. Magnus made careful note of each discovery, ensuring that valuable innovations were shared across the growing network of reconnected worlds. But technology was not the only treasure recovered through webway exploration. As Magnus reached out through the crystalline passages, he sensed something that made him pause in his routine monitoring. an alien presence, vast and ancient, observing the latest human expeditions with what could only be described as astonishment. Eldar. The contact came as a whisper across dimensions, carried through psychic frequencies that only beings of immense power could access. Magnus felt the alien consciousness testing his defenses, probing the edges of his awareness with the delicate touch of a species that had mastered the webway millennia before humanity's birth. "Impressive, Mon-Ki," the voice carried notes of grudging respect. "We did not think your kind capable of such refinement." Magnus smiled, recognizing the opportunity for contact with a species that had long been both enemy and reluctant ally to humanity. Through the Golden Throne systems, he projected his own consciousness into the webway's higher dimensions, meeting the Eldar observer in a realm where thought took physical form. The being that manifested before him wore the elaborate robes of a farseer, her ancient features marked by centuries of precognitive visions. Her presence radiated power and wisdom, but also something Magnus had not expected: curiosity tinged with hope. "Farseer," Magnus acknowledged, inclining his head with the respect due to a fellow wielder of the arcane arts. "You observe our expeditions. Are we trespassing in realms you consider your own?" The Eldar's laugh was like crystal bells in a winter wind. "Trespassing? Child of the anathema, you have done what we thought impossible. You have cleansed the webway of corruption, strengthened its barriers against the never-born, and guided your species through its passages without awakening the hunger of she who thirsts." Magnus felt a surge of pride at the acknowledgement. The Eldar were masters of the webway, having used its passages for millions of years. For them to admit that humanity had achieved something they considered impossible was perhaps the greatest validation of his work. "The Emperor's vision," Magnus said simply. "Humanity was always meant to walk these paths. I have merely corrected the errors that delayed our inheritance." "Your Emperor," the Farseer mused, her ancient eyes studying Magnus with disconcerting intensity. "He burned still upon his golden seat, does he not? Reduced to whispers and shadows, sustained only by the sacrifice of thousands." "He lives," Magnus replied, his voice carrying a note of warning. "And his vision lives through those who serve it." The Farseer's expression softened, and Magnus caught a glimpse of something unexpected in her alien features: sympathy. "I meant no insult, guardian of the Crimson Path. We have watched your vigil, witnessed your sacrifice. Few beings in this galaxy understand the weight of eternal duty as you have come to understand it." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent pulse through the Golden Throne's communication systems. Magnus felt his attention drawn back to the material realm, where Librarian Prime Calith was coordinating responses to what appeared to be a developing crisis. "My lord," she reported, her usual confidence replaced by urgency. "Psychic disturbances in the Cygnus sector. Something is attempting to breach the barriers between realms." Magnus immediately shifted his focus, his consciousness diving through layers of reality to examine the disturbance. What he found sent a chill through his psychic essence: a nascent chaos incursion, still in its earliest stages, but growing stronger with each passing moment. A group of cultists on an isolated mining world had somehow acquired knowledge of demonic summoning, and their rituals were beginning to tear holes in the fabric of reality. In the old days, such an incursion might have gone undetected until it was too late to contain. But now, with Magnus's enhanced awareness, spanning the galaxy and the webway providing rapid response capabilities, intervention was not only possible but immediate. "Dispatch Strike Force Aurelius through Gate Complex 7, Magnus commanded, his voice carrying across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Full psychic support protocols. I want those cultists neutralized and the breach sealed within 6 hours. The response was swift and efficient. Through the webway's passages, elite Imperial forces moved with unprecedented speed toward the threatened world. Magnus watched their progress, while simultaneously weaving psychic barriers around the nascent breach, containing its growth until physical intervention could arrive. The cultists never stood a chance. Expecting to have weeks or months to complete their rituals, they found themselves facing Space Marines and Imperial Guard units within hours of beginning their summoning. The demons they had begun to manifest were banished before they could fully enter the material realm, and the would-be chaos sorcerers were eliminated with prejudicial efficiency. "Impressive," the Farseer's voice whispered across the psychic link they had established. "Your response time has improved considerably since the old days. I remember when such incursions required months of preparation to address." Magnus felt a surge of grim satisfaction. "The webway provides more than just rapid transportation," he explained. "It offers strategic depth. We can detect threats earlier, respond faster, and coordinate responses across vast distances without relying on the warp's uncertain currents." "And your psychers," the Farseer observed. "They show remarkable discipline. We have watched your training methods with considerable interest." That was perhaps Magnus's greatest achievement. The new generation of Imperial psychers bore little resemblance to their predecessors. Instead of broken souls driven by fear and desperation, they were confident practitioners of their arts, trained from childhood to understand both the potential and the dangers of their abilities. They served the Imperium not as barely controlled weapons, but as valued specialists whose skills were essential to the new order. "The key is understanding," Magnus explained to the ancient alien. "Fear breeds corruption. Knowledge breeds control. We no longer treat psychic ability as a curse to be contained, but as a gift to be cultivated." The results spoke for themselves. Psychic phenomena among the general population had decreased dramatically as proper training became available. Demon possessions and chaos cults were detected and eliminated before they could take root. Most importantly, humanity was developing its psychic potential in ways that strengthened rather than endangered the species. "You have achieved something remarkable, Monkich," the Farseer admitted. "A psychic renaissance without the usual corruption and madness. Your fallen sons would be proud." The words struck Magnus like a physical blow, but the pain was tempered by recognition of their truth. Everywhere he looked, he could see the influence of the Thousand Sons legacy. The new training protocols bore traces of methods Ahriman had developed. The psychic detection networks used principles that Sobek had theorized. The careful balance between power and restraint reflected lessons that had been learned through tragic experience. "They live on in what we build," Magnus said quietly. "Their knowledge, their dedication, their understanding of the powers we wield, it all contributes to what the Imperium has become." As if summoned by his words, the latest generation of students arrived for their advanced training. Magnus watched through the Golden Throne sensors as young psychers from across the galaxy gathered in the palace's training halls. They came from dozens of worlds, representing every human culture and tradition, united by their gifts and their dedication to using those gifts in service of something greater than themselves. Their instructor was a remarkable young woman named Adept Lyrian, herself a product of the new training regimens. She had been born with tremendous psychic potential that would have inevitably led to possession or death in the old system. Instead, she had been carefully guided through years of education and practice, emerging as a master of her abilities and a teacher capable of passing that mastery on to others. "Today we will practice webway navigation," Lyrian announced to her students, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never known fear of her own power. Remember, the crystalline passages respond to intent and will. Doubt creates turbulence. Certainty creates clarity. Magnus watched as the students entered the training sections of the webway, their movements careful but confident. None showed the trembling terror that had once marked psychic instruction. They had been taught from the beginning that their abilities were tools to be mastered, not curses to be endured. The transformation was remarkable. Where once the Imperium had struggled with rogue psychers and chaos corruption, it now boasted the most disciplined psychic forces in the galaxy. The new generation served as navigators who could guide ships through both warp and webway, as communication specialists who could maintain contact across vast distances, and as defenders who could detect and counter psychic threats before they manifested. "Your species adapts quickly," the Farseer observed, her mental voice carrying notes of approval. "Given proper guidance, you achieve in decades what took us millennia to develop." "We had excellent teachers," Magnus replied, thinking not just of the Eldar, but of all the lessons learned through failure and sacrifice. Sometimes the best education comes from understanding the consequences of ignorance. As the day progressed, Magnus found himself reflecting on the broader transformation of the Imperium. The webway network now connected over 1,000 worlds directly, with secondary connections reaching thousands more. Trade flowed freely along routes that were immune to warp storms and Xenos interdiction. Communication was instantaneous across previously impossible distances. Most importantly, humanity was expanding again, not just conquering territory, but actually growing, learning, and evolving. "The Golden Age approaches," Magnus murmured to himself, watching as reports flowed in from across the galaxy. New colonies established, lost knowledge recovered, threats detected and eliminated before they could take root. It was the future the Emperor had envisioned, the destiny that had justified every sacrifice made in its pursuit. The Eldar Farseer's presence gradually faded as their conversation drew to its natural conclusion, but her parting words lingered in Magnus's consciousness. "We will watch your progress with interest, guardian of the Crimson Path. Perhaps there is hope for this galaxy after all." Alone again, upon the Golden Throne, Magnus allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. 7 years of patient work were bearing fruit beyond his wildest expectations. The Imperium was stronger, safer, and more prosperous than it had been in millennia. Humanity's psychic potential was being developed safely and productively. The galaxy itself was becoming a more hospitable place for those who sought order over chaos. But the work was far from finished. There were still lost colonies to find, still threats to counter, still knowledge to recover and preserve. The Golden Age was approaching, but it would require continued vigilance to achieve and maintain. Magnus the Red settled deeper into his eternal vigil, ready to guide humanity through whatever challenges lay ahead. The future stretched before them, like the crystalline pathways of the webway, infinite in possibility and bright with promise. Chapter 12. The Crimson Throne. 1,000 years had passed since Magnus first took his place upon the Golden Throne, and the galaxy bore witness to the fulfillment of dreams that had once seemed impossible. From his seat at the nexus of human consciousness, Magnus surveyed an Imperium that stretched across the stars like a network of living light, its worlds connected not by the treacherous currents of the warp, but by the crystalline certainty of the webway. The transformation was absolute. Where once humanity had huddled on isolated worlds, praying that supply ships would survive their passage through chaos-infested space, now children grew up taking instantaneous travel between star systems for granted. The webway network spanned the galaxy, its passages maintained by generations of psychers trained in methods that would have seemed miraculous to their predecessors. What had begun as Magnus's desperate attempt at redemption had become the foundation of humanity's greatest age. "Status report from all sectors, my lord," announced Epistolary Prime Valdris, the current head of the Webway administration. The elderly psyker approached the Golden Throne with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his entire career serving in an age of unprecedented prosperity. "All primary gates functional, secondary networks operating at optimal efficiency. No chaos incursions detected in over 3 standard years." Magnus nodded, feeling a satisfaction that had deepened over the centuries. 3 years without a single successful chaos incursion. It was a testament to both human evolution and the vigilance that he and his successors had maintained. The early warning systems he had established could detect chaos corruption while it was still forming, and the response networks could neutralize threats before they fully manifested. "And the colonial expansion reports?" Magnus asked, his consciousness automatically cycling through status updates from across the galaxy. 17 new worlds brought into compliance this year, my lord, all through peaceful contact and voluntary integration. The Bellerophon sector has requested inclusion in the primary webway network, and the Macarian systems have achieved full technological integration with imperial standards. The report was typical of the New Age: expansion through diplomacy and mutual benefit rather than conquest and subjugation. When humanity could offer instantaneous travel, perfect communication, and protection from the predations of chaos, few civilizations chose isolation over integration. The Imperium had become not just a government, but a genuine community of worlds united by shared purpose and mutual prosperity. Through the Golden Throne's vast sensor networks, Magnus could perceive the scope of what they had achieved. 1 billion worlds connected by the webway's crystalline passages, trillions of human souls living lives free from the fear that had defined their species for millennia. Most remarkably of all, a generation of psychers who served not as barely controlled weapons, but as valued members of society, their abilities integrated into every aspect of human civilization. On distant Nocturne, master artificers worked with psychic enhancers to forge artifacts of unprecedented beauty and utility. In the shipyards of Mars, Techmarines collaborated with telepathic engineers to design vessels that could navigate both warp and webway with equal facility. Across the Imperium, psychic talent was no longer a curse to be hidden or a gift to be feared. It was simply another aspect of human diversity, as natural and valuable as any other skill. The Psyker Academy's report record enrollment again this year, Valdris continued. Demand for training continues to exceed capacity, but the new facilities on Prospero Prime should address the shortage. Prospero Prime. Magnus allowed himself a moment of bittersweet reflection. The world that bore his homeworld's name had been established 3 centuries ago as the primary center for psychic education, its libraries containing not just the preserved knowledge of the original Prospero, but the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of careful study. It was, in many ways, what Prospero itself might have become if the galaxy had been a kinder place. "My lord?" Valdris inquired, noting his Primarch's momentary silence. "I was remembering," Magnus said simply. "Continue your report." As the administrative details flowed past his awareness, Magnus found his thoughts turning to those who had made this golden age possible. His father, the Emperor, whose vision had sustained them through the darkest hours. His brothers, loyal and traitor alike, whose struggles had taught humanity the price of division. Most of all, his sons, the 1,000 sons who had followed him into damnation and death so that others might find redemption. Their sacrifice had meaning now, Every psyker who learned to control their abilities without fear, every world that joined the Imperium through peaceful contact rather than conquest, every child who grew up never knowing the terror of chaos corruption, all of it was built upon the foundation of what the Thousand Suns had given up. Lord Magnus, a familiar voice, whispered at the edge of his consciousness. For a moment, Magnus thought it might be another manifestation of his fallen sons, but as the presence strengthened, he realized its true source, his father's spirit, barely sustained by the life support systems, but still clinging to existence after 1,000 years of mechanical preservation. "Father," Magnus replied, opening a private channel between their minds, "you honor me with your attention. I wanted to speak with you while I still could." The Emperor's voice carried notes of infinite weariness, but also of profound satisfaction. "The doctors tell me that the life support systems are beginning to fail. After all these millennia, even I have limits." Magnus felt a surge of alarm. The Emperor's presence had been a constant companion throughout his vigil, a reassuring whisper that offered guidance in moments of uncertainty. The thought of losing that connection entirely was almost unbearable. "There must be something we can do," Magnus said. "The technology exists to—" "No, my son," the Emperor interrupted gently. "I have lived far longer than any being was meant to live. I have seen my species rise from barbarism to claim the stars themselves. Most importantly, I have seen the future I dreamed of come to pass under your guidance. It is time for me to rest." The admission hung between them like a benediction. Magnus felt tears he had not shed in centuries threatening to spill from his eyes. "Have I served well?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of a millennium's doubt and hope. "You have exceeded my greatest expectations," the Emperor replied, his mental voice carrying warmth that Magnus had rarely heard, even in their most intimate moments. "The Imperium you have helped create is everything I hoped it could become. United without being uniform, strong without being oppressive, wise without being stagnant. You have proven that redemption is not just possible but transformative." Magnus closed his eyes and reached out through the Golden Throne systems, feeling the pulse of human civilization flowing through the galaxy like the heartbeat of some vast organism. Everywhere he touched, he found evidence of growth, learning, and peaceful expansion. The species that had once been defined by its capacity for violence and destruction had learned to create and nurture instead. "The price was so high," Magnus whispered, thinking of all who had died to make this future possible. "Your broken body, my fallen sons, the years of war and suffering before we found our path. All worthy prices for what we have achieved," the Emperor assured him. "A galaxy at peace, humanity free to explore its potential without fear, chaos held at bay not through constant warfare, but through the simple fact that there are so few souls desperate enough to embrace its promises. This is victory, Magnus, complete and final victory." The truth of those words settled into Magnus's consciousness like sunlight after a long night. For the first time in a millennium, chaos was truly retreating. The great powers of the warp still existed, but they found little purchase in a galaxy where humanity had learned to fulfill its needs through cooperation rather than exploitation, where psychic abilities were developed safely rather than suppressed or corrupted, where hope had replaced despair as the defining characteristic of human civilization. "I forgive you," the Emperor said suddenly, his voice so faint that Magnus had to strain to hear it. "For Prospero, for the webway breach, for all the mistakes that seemed so catastrophic at the time. Your failures taught you wisdom, and that wisdom has saved us all." "And I forgive you," Magnus replied, understanding finally dawning in his ancient mind, "for the prohibition against psychic study, for the secrets you kept, for the harshness that drove me to seek forbidden knowledge. We were both trying to protect humanity in the only ways we knew how." The Emperor's presence began to fade, but before it disappeared entirely, Magnus felt a final surge of emotion from his father: love, pride, and deep satisfaction at a duty finally completed. "The vigil is yours now, my son," the Emperor whispered. "Guard them well." And then he was gone, his spirit finally released from its 1,000-year bondage to mortality. Magnus felt the moment of his passing like a bell tolling across the galaxy, a sound that marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. Alone upon the golden throne, Magnus wept for his father, for his sons, and for himself. But these were tears of completion rather than loss, the grief of someone who had finally laid down a burden that had been carried for far too long. When the tears stopped, Magnus opened his eyes and looked out across the galaxy that was now truly his to guard. Through the webway's crystalline passages, he could sense the pulse of human life on 1 billion worlds. In the depths of space, exploration fleets pushed ever outward, seeking new wonders and new civilizations to welcome into the Imperium's embrace. Most remarkably of all, he could feel the steady evolution of human consciousness itself, the gradual development of psychic abilities that would one day make his own vigil unnecessary. "My lord," Valdris approached hesitantly, obviously sensing that something momentous had occurred. "Is everything well?" "Everything is as it should be," Magnus replied, and for the first time in a millennium, he truly meant those words. "The Emperor is at rest, and his work is complete. Now we must continue the task he began, not as his servants, but as the inheritors of his vision." The implications were staggering. For 1,000 years, the Imperium had been guided by the remote authority of a dying god. Now it would be led by the living will of a species that had finally learned to trust itself. It was a transition that would require careful management, but Magnus had faith in the institutions and traditions they had built together. "Convene the High Lords," Magnus commanded. "It is time to begin the next phase of human evolution, the age when we no longer need guardians, because we have learned to guard ourselves." As the great machinery of government began to respond to his words, Magnus allowed himself one final moment of reflection. He had chosen love over pride, sacrifice over selfishness, redemption over revenge. The cost had been everything he held dear: his sons, his father, his own mortality. But in exchange, he had purchased something beyond price, a future where humanity could reach for the stars without fear, where children could grow up knowing that their universe was fundamentally benevolent, where the species he had watched struggle against darkness for millennia could finally claim its birthright as masters of their own destiny. The choice had been worth it. Every moment of pain, every sacrifice demanded, every year of lonely vigil, all of it had led to this moment of perfect vindication. Magnus the Red had saved humanity, not through conquest or domination, but through the simple recognition that love was stronger than pride, hope was more powerful than fear, and redemption was always possible for those willing to pay its price. From his seat upon the golden throne, Magnus settled into his eternal vigil with renewed purpose. The work was not finished, might never be finished, but it was good work, worthy work, work that gave meaning to every sacrifice that had made it possible. in the depths of the imperial palace, surrounded by the humming machinery of divinity, Magnus the Red watched over humanity's future, with the quiet satisfaction of a father whose children had finally learned to walk on their own. The golden age had come at last, and it would endure for as long as love remained stronger than the darkness between the stars.